Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the second part of What If Izuku Was Given a Second Chance as Angel? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku pulled himself up onto the roof of a tall building and sat on the edge. He was at least 10 stories up, and the people below looked small. What would happen if I jumped? Sure, Shoto and Shinso might be sad for a bit, but they would get over me fast. I would be helping. One less criminal on the streets, right? People only get hurt around me. His vision started to blur as tears fell onto the street below. He felt the wind rush against him, pulling his hood off and ruffling his hair. He was leaning closer and closer and closer until he heard a voice from behind him. "What's a kid like you doing up here so late?" Izuku froze in place, recognizing that voice from the news. "Go away, Hawks." "Well, that's kind of rude." Hawks sat next to Izuku, who quickly wiped away his tears and stretched his wings. He looked over at Izuku, and suddenly his eyes lit up in recognition. "Wait a minute, you're Angel, right? I saw that video of you jumping out that window. You looked so cool." At a loss for words, Izuku stared blankly at the hero. He blinked slowly and turned his stare back to the street below, letting all the lights blend together. He didn't register the fact that Hawk's wings were angled towards him, ready to move at any moment. "I wanted to be assigned to your case, but it got denied from the pro already on it. Eraserhead, I think?" Hawks said, shooting worried glances at the vigilante. And then, Izuku spoke. "I don't know why I'm here. I have a feeling you're not talking about the roof." Izuku nodded, bringing his knees to his chest. "I cause more harm than good. It would be better if I just jumped now." "Don't say that, Angel. I have heard and seen all the good you do." "You don't know what I've done," Izuku whispered. "You're right. But you don't know everything about me either. Do you think I should jump off too?" Izuku looked up in shock. "You're a hero. People depend on you." Hawks smiled at Izuku. "They depend on you too. Have you seen what people say about you? There are hundreds of people thanking you for saving them. And there are people that need saving in the future. You may not have the official title, but you are a hero. Now what do you say we get you down from here?" Silent tears fell down his face as he processed everything the hero had said. Only half there mentally, he let Hawks pick him up and fly them both down to the ground. When he put Izuku down, the vigilante looked up through his bangs. "You were serious about what you said up there, right?" Hawks ruffled Izuku's hair and grinned down at him. "Of course I was. You should get home and rest. You probably have school tomorrow, right?" "I don't want to. School's canceled tomorrow anyway." Hawks raised his eyebrows and thought for a moment. "Then why don't I treat you to a late-night snack? I know a great 24/7 bakery a couple blocks away." Izuku stared at the ground and nodded, allowing Hawks to steer him towards the bakery. The bell rang as he opened the door, and a cheery voice welcomed them. "Welcome to— Oh, it's you, Hawks. The usual?" Izuku looked up at the girl. She looked to be his age, with short brown hair and permanent blush on her cheeks. She finally noticed him and gasped. "Oh, I know you. You're Angel, right? Wow, this is so cool." Taking a deep breath, Izuku straightened up and smiled at her. "Hi." The girl grinned and held out her hand. "I'm Ochako Uraraka. It's nice to meet you." Izuku took her hand, saying, "I would introduce myself, but it seems you know who I am already." Uraraka giggled and got to work packaging up some baked goods. Izuku stood off to the side while Hawks paid, and they sat down at a table close to the register. Uraraka looked up at the door and then went to join them, flipping the chair around so she leaned against the back. "So, Angel, what do you think of Hawks?" Taken aback by the question, Izuku stopped nibbling on the brownie he was eating. "He is way too cheerful," Izuku sarcastically said, raising his eyebrows at the hero. Uraraka smirked and nudged Hawks playfully. "That's not the worst thing he could say about you." Hawks laughed loudly, wings stretching about behind him. Now in a much better mood, Izuku started to smile too. "I have a question for you. How do you know the Hawks so well?" "Oh, he comes to this bakery whenever he takes a night shift, and I work here mostly at night because of school. Cool, Izuku grinned, making a mental note that he should take Shoto here or at least bring him back something. The three of them talked for hours, until the first rays of sunlight shone through the windows. Hawks stretched his wings out in the sunlight and yawned. Well, we all should probably head home now, seeing as none of us obviously got any sleep. Maybe I'll see you around, Angel? Izuku smiled, a genuine one, and happily replied, yeah, that would be cool. Uraraka tilted her head at him and jokingly shouted, don't forget to visit me. He turned to her and laughed. You got it. They all went their separate ways, Hawks flying up into the clouds, Uraraka switching with whoever had the morning shift, and Izuku decided he should go visit Shoto. After all, he had saved his life. He quickly arrived at the Todoroki house only to see Endeavor through the window. He ducked down into the bushes and crept to the opposite side of the house. He went to jump up to the second-floor window, but it was too late and he remembered that he had almost double the power from before. He launched himself up into the air and landed with a thud on the rooftop. Shaking his head to clear it, he swung down through Shoto's window before unwanted thoughts crept back in. He sat on his friend's bed, kicking his legs as he waited for his friend to come back upstairs. Pretty soon he heard a loud Shoto, and then the door opened. Shoto walked in and slammed the door behind him, and then spotted Izuku. Instantly he tackled his friend into a hug, leaving Izuku stunned. As soon as it happened, Shoto wrenched himself away and started interrogating Izuku. What happened? Where have you been? Are you okay? How does Present Mike know about you? Izuku held up his hands to stop the onslaught of questions, and replied, I'm not sure what exactly happened. I've been with Hawks, I'm fine, and it's a long story. Shoto crossed his arms and looked the vigilante up and down. I have time. Explain. And so, Izuku did. That morning, Aizawa was released from the hospital. He probably should have stayed another few days, but he wasn't a big fan of them. As soon as he got home, his husband guided him to the couch and sat down. We need to talk about Angel. Agreed. Did something happen while I was out? Hisashi sighed and ran his hands through his hair. I'm not sure exactly what happened because I didn't get there until after it all. All I know is I saw you lying on the ground, and a half-dead thing next to you. Their leader called it a Nomu. The blonde nodded and continued. The villains dragged the Nomu into a portal along with the blue-haired one, but not before Snipe got some hits in. And what? Angel was lying on the ground in Todoroki's arms, completely unresponsive. What? Aizawa gasped, wincing from his injuries. Yeah. When I went to help, I swear Todoroki was going to attack me right there until I promised I wouldn't take his mask off. Mind reeling with new information, Aizawa said, so Todoroki and Angel definitely know each other, and there is a chance he knows Angel's identity. Continue, please. After that, I took Angel away from USJ and he became responsive again. I treated his injuries and dropped him off somewhere closer to where he said his house was. He was injured and you let him walk home alone? Aizawa demanded. He wouldn't let me go anywhere near his home. You know how he is. Hisashi argued back. Sighing, Aizawa leaned back. I know, I'm sorry. You're not who I'm actually mad at. I know, it's okay. Aizawa took a deep breath and faced his husband. We have something else to focus on now. The sports festival is coming up, and you know what that means. All students are going to be there. Hisashi's eyes brightened as he replied, which means Angel will too. We need to find him, Hisashi. We will, don't worry. We'll figure this out. Miles away, Shigaraki limped over to the old TV behind the bar. What do we do, sensei? That NPC spoiled my plans. A deep voice sounded from inside. Tamura, I expected better. That wasn't NPC. Did you see him use his quirk against Nomu? Understanding crossed Shigaraki's eyes, soon followed by raw anger. It was him, wasn't it? That little brat. His voice seethed with rage, and a section of the bar crumbled to dust as he slammed his hands down. Yes. It seems little Izuku has been doing well for himself. But do not worry about your plans, Tamura. Izuku will be coming home very, very soon. With that, the TV went silent, and Shigaraki stalked over to Kurojiri, muttering under his breath as he scratched at his neck. Not if I have anything to say about it. Izuku crouched in the corner of the room, listening to the footsteps outside, hoping that none of them would stop outside the door. For an hour, nothing happened and he started to nod off. And then he heard all too familiar footsteps. They were lighter than the others and dragged by. The door creaked open, and he was met with the blank stare of Shigaraki. "Sensei wants to see you," he spat, crossing his arms as he glared at Izuku. Curling up tighter, Izuku shook his head and ducked between his knees. "I said Sensei wants you," he shouted, and reached out to grab Izuku. At first, all he felt was a dull ache as he gaped at Shigaraki. Then the burning started. Izuku screamed, feeling his arm crumble underneath the agonizing touch. Quickly, multiple people rushed into the room and pulled him off Izuku, but the damage was done. Raw pain pulsed through his arm, the muscle exposed to the air. He could feel the doctors dragging him away, and then, gasping, Izuku woke up in a cold sweat. He rubbed at the scar on his arm as he looked around, relaxing when he recognized his surroundings. Amaya looked up at him with wide eyes and twitched her ears. He placed a trembling hand on her head, and she instantly pressed up against it and started purring. He glanced over at the clock. It read 6 a.m., which sucked because he had only managed to fall asleep at 3. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and dragged himself out of bed. Half asleep, he pulled on his yudata uniform, fed Amaya, and stumbled out the door. Before he knew it, he arrived at Udare, and he walked over to General Studies. As soon as he stepped through the door, Shinso grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the back of the class. "So what are we doing about the sports festival?" Shinso whispered. Izuku quickly opened his mouth to dismiss what he knew Shinso was getting at, but then Hawk's words rang in his head. "You are a hero." He remembered what Eraserhead had said too. Izuku took a deep breath, and a mischievous light danced in his eyes. "We're gonna kick their asses, of course." Shinso's eyes widened, and he quickly matched Izuku's Cheshire smile. "Okay, first things first, what is your quirk?" At this, Shinso visibly flinched, and his grin faded. "Do I have to tell you?" Izuku nodded, keeping eye contact with him. "Mind control," Shinso muttered. He glanced up at Izuku, and braced himself when he saw a blank expression on the green-haired boy's face. "We can work with that." "What?" "We can use that. Mind control. Actually, that might be exactly what we need." "You don't think I'm a freak?" Izuku smiled. "Of course not." Shinso shook his head in disbelief. "Okay then, what's your quirk?" "Oh, it's a minor enhancement quirk." If Shinso had been looking more closely, he would have seen the flash of panic in Izuku's eyes. Izuku took a deep breath, regaining his usual bored look. "Meet me after school at Takoba Municipal Beach." Shinso looked quizzically at Izuku, and then nodded. The first few classes passed by in a blur, and soon it was lunch. They sat down at their usual table, and soon Shoto joined them. "Are you going to eat anything, Izuku?" Shoto said after a few minutes. Startled out of his own thoughts, Izuku pushed at his food a bit. "I'm not really that hungry," he said. "If you say so." "Hey Shoto, can you meet me and Shinso after school?" "Sure, what for?" Izuku and Shinso glanced at each other. "You'll see." "Fight me, bitch." "I'm sorry, what?" Shinso said, looking at Izuku, who was facing Shoto. "If I'm going to teach you how to fight, you should see a demonstration first." Shinso stared at them, jaw dropped. "Do you even know how to fight?" At that, Izuku grinned and tilted his head. "Watch and learn." He leaped at Shoto, who pushed his hand to the side to block. Instantly, Shoto rushed a trail of ice at Izuku, who narrowly missed it by an inch. Seeing Shoto was moving his other hand for another, he started sprinting toward one of the piles of trash. Just as he felt the chill nearing his back, he ran up a refrigerator and kicked off, back flipping over the sharp spikes. He landed on top of the ice and slid down at Shoto. Before his friend could recover his wits, he leaped off the ice, twisting his body midair to gain momentum. As soon as he made contact with Shoto's shoulders, he twisted his body harshly to the right. His sent Shoto crashing to the ground, with Izuku right on top of him. His long hair brushed against the peppermint-colored boy's face as he smirked down at him. "Okay, what the fuck was that?" Izuku jerked his head over to Shinso, who was freaking out. Well, you can't pick that up in a week, but I'll teach you some better techniques. Shinso blinked at them and then shook his head. You know what, I'm gonna just pretend that that's perfectly normal. Great. Let's get started then. After hours of sparring sessions, the three boys all collapsed on the sand watching the sunset. Thanks. Izuku looked up at Shinso in confusion. For what? Everything, I guess. No one has really taken this much time to help me before. Yuta Todoroki. Just call me Shoto, he said, smiling at Shinso. After laying there for a bit, Izuku stood up and brushed sand off his clothes. Welp, time for me to go. Shoto glanced at him with a knowing look and stood up. See you tomorrow. Shinso called out and headed back to his house. Are you patrolling tonight? Shoto asked as soon as they were out of earshot. Izuku nodded, and Shoto reached out an arm to stop him. Be careful, okay? You look like you didn't get a lot of sleep. And make sure to eat something. Izuku laughed and pushed him aside. You sound like a parent? Shoto looked at him and tilted his head, frowning slightly. Yeah, but I'm serious. Izuku sighed and looked up at him. I'll try. Shoto stared at him for a few seconds and then sighed. But, see you tomorrow. See ya? Izuku walked home, and as soon as he was inside put on his outfit. He fed Amaya again, and petted her a few times. Bye Amaya, he said. He jumped over to the rooftop where he usually met Eraserhead, and stared blankly at the city. After a few minutes, he shook himself out of his daze and went to his usual patrol route. Not even a minute later, he heard the familiar sound of gunfire. Jumping down from the roof, he rolled into the alley and kicked a gun out of one of the criminal's hands. The other one quickly turned her gun toward Izuku, but he knocked it out of her hand with a twirl of his bow and tossed her. Tossing the other guy as well, he tied them up and texted Tsukachi. He had gotten the number from Eraserhead. He shoved his phone into his pocket and jumped up back onto the roof. He crouched onto the edge, listening carefully. Not hearing anything, he kept walking until he found himself outside his usual patrol route. He jumped off the building and hit the ground rolling, quickly standing up after. However, as soon as he did, a wave of dizziness came over him, and he leaned against the wall to stabilize himself. Maybe I shouldn't have patrolled today. He turned around to go home before he heard it. A faint buzzing sound, almost like electricity. Instantly he was on his guard, scanning his surroundings silently. Hearing a faint whoosh from his left, he turned to face the sound. Before he knew it, he was on the ground with the breath knocked out of him. Scrambling up off the ground, he frantically twisted his head to try and spot his attacker. He felt an uncomfortable poking sensation in his lower back, and his entire world erupted in pain. A sharp burning sensation spread throughout his body along with the feeling his skin was melting. He screamed louder than he thought was possible, until his throat felt raw. Quickly, he felt his attacker pull away and he collapsed to the ground twitching. Vision blurred, he tried to move his arms and was met with nothing. If he was moving, it wasn't of his own accord. He gasped for air, trying his best to stay awake. His nerves felt like they were on fire, and his limbs were heavy. His ears rang, which was why he did not notice the person's approach until they reached down to touch him. As he felt the hands on his shoulders, a bolt of fear shot through him because he thought it was his attacker coming back to finish him off. He barely registered being dragged upright and arms around him. The last thing he felt was his mask being pulled off, and then the world faded into black. Shinso liked taking walks at night. He lived in a quieter part of town, so at night there were never many people around. He always expected the odd person here and there, but what he did not expect was to hear a blood-curdling scream. He instantly was on high alert, and against his better judgment ran towards the sound. His gaze quickly snapped onto a hooded figure running away and quickly disappearing behind a building. Then it moved to the small figure on the ground. A small pile of green and black. A spark of recognition clicked, and he bent down to confirm his suspicions. And there it was, the familiar black mask and the slight glint of emerald eyes. Angel. He reached over to lift up the vigilante whose hood slipped off to reveal fluffy green hair. Very, very familiar hair. After a couple moments of hesitation, he looked into the half-conscious vigilante's eyes. He glanced around to make sure nobody was near, and pulled off Angel's mask. Izuku couldn't quite open his eyes, but he could feel. Soft sheets surrounded him, and he was slightly propped up. A dull pain throbbed throughout his body, and his head pounded. Eventually he managed to crack open his eyes, squinting at the sudden brightness. "You're awake." His eyes flew open, and he turned his head sharply towards the voice. "Oh no," Izuku whispered, hands reaching up to grab at a mask that wasn't there. Shinso tilted his head slightly and held up the mask. "Looking for this?" he said, expression carefully still. Shinso, I can explain, I promise. I really didn't want you to find out this way." "Yeah, well, here we are." Shinso's voice hardened in anger, and he threw the mask at Izuku. "No wonder you always looked dead tired, you were up all night fighting." Izuku opened his mouth to say something, but stopped. After a few long seconds of silence, he spoke. "Look, I'm sorry for not telling you, but I had my reasons. I have a lot of enemies, and I don't want the people I care about getting caught up with them." Shinso glared at him, but soon his expression softened. "I guess I can understand that." Izuku let out a sigh of relief, and sank down into the bed. "Hold on, does Todoroki know?" "Yes." "Well, that's not much of a surprise. Why did you tell him and not me?" "It was because he knew Angel before me," Izuku explained. "You talk like they are two different people. It makes things easier, making Angel seem separate. So I don't slip up. But I have one more question. What on earth happened back there? It looked like that guy was going to kill you before he saw me and ran." Izuku shuddered at the thought of him. "I honestly have no idea what his problem was. I've never seen him before." "But you should probably get some rest, you look like you're gonna pass out any minute." Realizing how tired he really was, he allowed his eyes to close, and fell asleep. Izuku woke up to the soft buzzing of his phone. Flinching at the pain, he reached into his pocket to grab it. "Where are you?" a worried voice said over the phone. "I'm at Shinso's," Izuku replied. "Oh, is that why he isn't at lunch?" Shoto questioned. "Is it lunch already?" Izuku said, glancing down at his phone to see the time. "Are we meeting up after school again?" "Well, if you're up for it, I was thinking we could do a little more hands-on training," Izuku said happily. "'Kay, I'll see you later, Izuku," Shoto replied before hanging up. "Are you going to be okay with training tonight?" Shinso spoke up from where he was in the next room. "Yeah, I'll be fine, I heal fast." Hours later, he was sitting on a rooftop with Todoroki and Shinso. "Izuku, what are you wearing?" Izuku tilted his head back to look at Shoto. "Oh yeah, Shinso knows now." Shoto glanced over at Shinso, who was leaning against a pole with his hands shoved in his pockets. Shrugging, Shinso pulled the hood over his head. Izuku pulled on his mask and motioned for the others to follow him. "Okay, so this is more of agility practice and exercise. But if we do see someone in need of an ass-kicking, only go down if you're sure you can handle it. And if we see Eraserhead, well, I'll just say run for your life. Okay, let's go." With that, he leaped into the air and hit the ground rolling, leaving his friends behind. "Keep up," he called back, and soon heard the sounds of them hitting the roof. Izuku started sprinting, smiling as the cool air hit his face. He slid under a pile of junk, and then twisted into a flip off the roof. He landed neatly on the other side and turned to watch the others. Shoto was handling himself fairly well, except Izuku caught him almost using his quirk to get across the roof. Shinso was doing okay as well, but he was still lacking in the strength department and barely made it over to the roof. They continued like that for a while until they heard noises from below them. Sliding to a stop, Izuku peered over to the ground below. "Perfect," he whispered, a Cheshire grin spreading across his face that was blocked by the mask. Below was a group of 5 people, 3 of which were picking a fight with the other 2. "Well, go stop them," Izuku whispered, nudging his friends. Shinso stared at him in shock, but Shoto was already getting ready to jump down. "Both insane," Shinso said, but he jumped down anyway. Taking a seat on the edge of the roof, Izuku looked down at his friends. Shinso had taken on the biggest of the 3, weaving in and out around him. "Smart. Using his weakness to your advantage." While he was big, he wasn't very fast, and Shinso worked around it. Shoto was fighting the other 2, punching one in the stomach and then turning neatly to give the other a kick to the ribs. Izuku tossed down some duct tape he kept in his pocket and the two boys tied them up. The other two had already fled the scene, and Izuku motioned for his friends to join him again. "Good job, guys. You're naturals." "I'm not sure that's a good thing," Shinso said, but he couldn't stop his smile from creeping up. That pattern continued for another hour until Izuku finally called it a night. "I mean, the sports festival is in 2 days, you guys should be well rested." After dropping off Shinso, Izuku and Shoto headed to the Todoroki house. "Good night, Shoto," Izuku said, smiling warmly. "I'll see you tomorrow," Shoto replied as he waved from his window. Pretty quickly, Izuku arrived back at his home. After feeding Amaya, he collapsed into bed and stared up at the ceiling. Logically, he knew that Eraserhead would recognize his fighting style, and his hair certainly didn't help. He only wished that things could stay like they used to, but all hopes of that were ruined when Shigaraki showed up. Thinking of that day made him sick to his stomach. Images of Eraserhead laying there on the ground lifeless haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Curling into a ball, he let his hair fall over his eyes. He was so tired, but he couldn't sleep. How could he? His entire life was going to collapse around him as soon as Eraserhead made the connection. He could choose to not fight in the festival, but his mind kept drifting back to Hawk's words. If he really had a chance to be anything but a murderer, but a villain, he had to try. Right? He wanted to say he woke up, but that would be total bullshit. He hadn't gotten a bit of sleep. Dragging himself out of bed, he stumbled to the bathroom and glazed at his reflection. What stared back was a small, skinny boy with dark circles that gave him a skeleton appearance. He blinked slowly, then reached down and splashed some cold water in his face. He tried to pat down his hair, but after a minute gave up and fluffed it back to its original state. He went through his usual morning routine, grabbing a small snack off the counter. On autopilot, he made his way to the UA holding up his I.D at the gate. He trudged along the campus. The chattering of other students surrounded him, but it was all sort of muted. Stepping in the building, he made his way to his class. And then it happened. Time seemed to slow as Izuku looked up in surprise. It was Eraserhead, covered in bandages. This was the first time he had seen him since that night. His chest started to tighten and his head began to spin, and he spun on his heel and ran in the opposite direction while taking a couple sharp turns until he had arrived in an empty hallway. He slammed into the wall, slowly dropping to the ground. He tried to take slow breaths, but that feeling of panic and despair wasn't going away. Why wasn't it going away? He didn't know how much time had passed before he had calmed down again. He slowly got up, walking toward his class. The rest of the day went on in silence. He only replied to his friends in one-word answers, and even then he wasn't really paying attention. "Hey," Shinso said impatiently, snapping his fingers in front of Izuku. "Are you going to be able to compete tomorrow? You don't look so great, man." "I'll be fine," Izuku muttered, staring through Shinso. "Sure, I'll believe it when I see it. No patrolling tonight, okay?" Eyes focusing back onto Shinso, he showed a lopsided, tired smile. "Yeah, probably a good idea. Here, take this." Shinso handed Izuku a small brownie in a plastic bag. Thanks. Just eat it right before you go to bed, okay? This sounds a lot like a murder attempt." Izuku mumbled, holding up the snack. "Huh, just eat it, got it?" Shinso said, rolling his eyes. Fine, fine, fine." "Shota, honey, are you sure you should be taking those off so soon?" Hizashi frowned at his husband, who was in the process of removing all the bandages. "I had Chio give me an extra strong session of healing. I don't think it would be good for anyone to see one of the teachers covered in bandages at what's supposed to be a safe school." "I guess you're right," Hizashi sighed, heading over to the kitchen to make dinner for the two of them. Aizawa sat down at the table, spreading out pages and pages of files. Files on Angel. There was everything from witness sightings, criminals he had caught, suspected students, possible quirks, and so much more. It was fascinating just how much he had accomplished in such a short period of time. Aizawa selected the case file containing possible students and took out the pages. He had picked them based on a few different factors. Quirks that could match, hair that could match, even height. But most importantly, they were all first years. Aizawa was positive that Angel wasn't lying about what year he was in, so it narrowed it down a lot. Most of the students were also in the hero course or support course. But the one thing they had in common was they would all be at the sports festival tomorrow. Now all he had to do was hope the vigilante wouldn't drop out in the early rounds. Izuku stared at the brownie across from him on the table. There was no way it was just a normal brownie. Shinso had never been a gift person. And if his years trapped in that place taught him anything, it was to not trust anything or anyone. But this was Shinso. He would never hurt him. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the dessert and ate it quickly. After a short staring contest with Amaya, Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. If it was poison, he would definitely be dead by now. But he did feel strangely tired, more than usual even. Even though he figured it was hopeless, he laid down on the couch and turned to look at the ceiling. But to his surprise, his eyes closed quickly and he was pulled into a dreamless sleep. Izuku woke up to daylight streaming in through dirty and cracked windows. What? Oh my gosh, I actually fell asleep. Izuku grinned and hopped off the couch. Walking over to the mirror again, he wasn't surprised to find not much has changed. Well, he figured 6 hours of sleep wouldn't be able to fix almost 4 days with basically no sleep, but it might just get him through the next few hours. Before he knew it, he was waiting with Shinso outside the arena. Well, you look a little more awake today. Yeah, Izuku's voice faltered as he saw the smug look on Shinso's face. Oh my god, you did lace that thing? Izuku shouted, pushing Shinso lightly. Oh relax, it was just some melatonin. I figured it wouldn't take much. Rolling his eyes, Izuku said, you're the worst. So, are you ready? Izuku's mood quickly turned, and he frowned slightly. Honestly, I'm not sure. You'll be fine. Just focus on the moment, okay? Don't think about what's going to happen after. Just do what feels right. Tilting his head up at his friend, Izuku showed a small smile. You're right. Let's do this. They both turned their heads toward the doors as they began to slowly open. The sounds of the cheering ground filled the room, and together they walked outside. Izuku squinted his eyes as bright sunlight washed over him. The roar from the crowds was deafening as he and Shinso joined the rest of the classes. Midnight was on the stage, and she invited one of the students from Class 1A to make a speech. Ida, as she said, made a pretty boring one about playing fairly and following the rules. Izuku glanced around the stadium, eventually spotting Aizawa and Hizashi in the announcer's booth. After a minute, Midnight quickly stopped him and announced the first event of the sports festival. Okay everybody, she shouted. After that, nice speech, it is time for the first event. The obstacle race. The crowd started cheering, and Izuku started to scan his competition as Midnight explained the rules. He could see a bright pink girl hopping up and down next to a girl who looked part frog. I think they were at USJ. He also saw a few students covered in support gear, and kids from his class muttering to themselves about how they had no chance to win. Just then, he got a strong feeling that something was wrong. Quickly flicking his eyes across the stands, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. He swallowed and bounced nervously on his feet. Was it really a good idea to be doing this? Eraserhead would know. Izuku knew the man wasn't stupid, all he had to do was drop out. But as he looked at Shinso, who was stretching in preparation, he knew he had to. Even though he never wanted to be a hero, the training in the hero course could help him as a vigilante. And maybe if he was really short on cash, he could become an underground hero like Eraserhead. And then it hit him. An unfamiliar feeling, like a warm light, started spreading throughout his body, and a small smile formed on his face. He actually felt hopeful. Come on. Shinso grabbed his arm and pulled him toward where everyone was lining up. He readied himself to run, feeling the power he took coursing through his veins. Midnight blew a whistle and they were off. Instantly the ground froze, and Izuku spotted Shoto dashing ahead. Izuku leapt up over the ice, neatly landing on a struggling student's shoulders before jumping up again, doing a flip and rolling to the ground. Before him stood giant robots, where multiple students were destroying and avoiding them. He darted through the wreckage, sliding under pieces and avoiding falling debris. He allowed himself a split second to glance back at Shinso, who he saw mind-controlling others to protect him while he ran behind Izuku. Smiling, he continued running until he got to the tightropes. He leaped as far as he could, landing a few steps from the edge and quickly crossing to solid ground. He continued this process until he made it across where he saw the landmines. Well, from the looks of it, he would be safe to cross it normally as he was at a good place. He followed the light footsteps in the dirt, crisscrossing and weaving along barren spots that were obviously mines. Suddenly one exploded right beside him, and he ducked to the ground. Shaking his hair back into place, he saw that Shoto and Kaken were racing for the finish. Shoto laid down an ice bridge and quickly sped toward the finish. Izuku saw his opportunity and slid across the ice where he crossed through the tunnel out into the stadium. Breathing heavily, he counted who else was there and saw he was in 15th place. Not that bad. Soon after, Shinso came jogging through the gate, and the two sat on the grass while the rest of the students filed through. Midnight went up on the podium and gestured to the large wheel of activities. And now for the next event. The wheel began to spin until it landed on treasure hunt. Midnight grinned and shouted, "This will take place in ground beta, if you will all make your way there." As the large group of students followed Midnight, Izuku finally saw Shoto. He jogged toward him and smiled. "Congrats on first place." "Thank you, but it was barely first." "Still first though," Izuku whispered. "Yeah, I guess you're right." They quickly arrived, and Midnight started to explain the rules. "All right everyone. 16 people will be moving on from this round, so of course there is 16 pieces of treasure. The treasure will be a small blue and white ball, and they are placed throughout the section of ground beta where you will be playing. Some of the treasure is hidden, some is out in the open, and combat is allowed. I wish you all luck. We will start in 5 minutes. Shoto looked down at Izuku and said, "Look, I'm really sorry but I need to work alone for this." Izuku shook his head at him, saying, "That's fine, I work better alone too." "Shinso, you good with that?" "Yeah, that works, I'll just wait for someone with a treasure to come to me." Izuku grinned, "All right, good luck you too." As soon as the words left his lips, the buzzer sounded and the doors creaked open. All 42 people darted forward, using their quirks to get inside as fast as they could. Izuku waited till most were in before he jogged inside, surveying the area. It reminded him of the laser tag place his mom took him once before she died. He jumped up, grabbing a pipe and pulling himself up. He crouched there, looking down at the open space where a large group was fighting over a treasure. He saw Shinso sneak off past them, and Shoto and Kaken were fighting a little further down. He continued climbing upward, and when he hit the ceiling, crawled forward. A few minutes later, he saw one of the treasures tucked between a couple pipes a little way down. However, he was not the only one to spot it. Another kid was dangling from a pipe, staring directly at Izuku. From the way his arms hung unnaturally, he knew the student had some kind of stretch quirk. After a second of hesitation, Izuku dashed for the treasure. An arm flung out in front of him, so he quickly dropped to the ground on his back and slid off the section of pipe. Twisting to the side, another arm whooshed past him. Izuku grabbed it, flipped on top, and used the bounce to fling himself up. He grabbed onto the pipe, flipping himself upright. He grabbed the treasure, crouched down, and launched himself forward. Turning midair, he saw the student following closely. The kid reached to grab Izuku again, and this time he didn't stop him. Izuku took hold of his wrist and pulled up. The kid was sent flying past him and crashed into the wall. Landing safely on the ground, Izuku took to the rafters again and sat to observe the students below. Suddenly, a familiar bob of brown hair caught his eye. Squinting, he watched as the girl slapped someone in the face reaching for her treasure, and the person started floating. She spun around to face who was behind her, and Izuku finally recognized her. It was Uraraka from the bakery. Izuku stared as she continued to fight her way out of the crowd, when a loud noise interrupted him. "Minute remaining." Midnight's voice rang out, echoing off the metal walls. Suddenly, everyone started panicking, lunging for whoever had the nearest treasure. Uraraka's eyes went wide, and she clapped her hands together. She rose toward the ceiling, touching everyone who went to grab at her on the way up. When she had a small handful of people floating around her, she touched her hands together, and they all began to plummet toward the ground. She grabbed onto a pipe above her and pulled herself upright. Then, to Izuku's surprise, she turned away from him and threw up. She relaxed onto the small ledge before catching Izuku's gaze. Her eyes narrowed for a second, but she was quickly distracted by the timer going off. Everyone freeze. The time has concluded. Everyone please make your way to the entrance and present your treasures. Izuku dropped down with the grace of a cat and walked toward the front. Glancing around, he saw it was mostly students from Class 1A, a couple from 1B, a girl from the support class, and him and Shinso from General Studies. Everyone with a treasure was instructed to head to the waiting rooms to be healed and rest, while the others were welcome to take part in some small events. He headed to the waiting area and sat down with Shinso and Shoto. Did everything go well for you guys? Izuku asked. Mostly, Bakugo put up a bit of a fight however, Shoto sighed. The trio glanced up at Bakugo, who was pacing while yelling at some kid with red spiky hair. He glanced over, spotting Shoto. Bakugo stormed over, saying, "I'm going to beat you, icy hot bastard. Just you wait." Izuku raised an eyebrow at him. Clearly he had not changed much since they were 6. Bakugo glanced over at Izuku, narrowing his eyes. "Do I know you from somewhere?" he asked. No," Izuku said, slightly turning his head. Bakugo looked him up and down, frowned, and returned to the other side of the room where he began whispering to the redhead. "What was that about?" Shinso questioned. "Oh, I knew him when I was little. He probably doesn't recognize me." His two friends stared at Izuku. "You were friends with that lunatic?" Shoto exclaimed. "He really isn't that bad when you get to know him," Izuku shrugged. "Why didn't you tell him?" asked Shinso. "Oh, it doesn't matter. It was a long time ago." Shinso frowned at him, but dropped the topic. A few minutes later, they were outside staring up at the matches. Shoto was fighting Shiro, Shinso was fighting Ojiro, and Izuku was fighting Uraraka. His eyes went wide, and he glanced at the girl who was staring back at him. He quickly turned his head away, pretending he was stretching. He felt bad, but knew he had to try and beat her at least. And of course, knowing his luck, he was the first match. He stepped into the ring, facing Uraraka, who looked nervous. Midnight's voice rang out from the podium. "Our first match, Uraraka from Class 1A, and Midoriya from General Studies." Aizawa winced in pain as he moved to sit in the large chair overlooking the stadium. "I knew you shouldn't have taken those bandages off so early," Hisashi said, rolling his eyes. "I'm fine," Aizawa gruffly said, sitting down. He watched over the event going on, waiting for the one-on-one battles to begin. He had already looked over the list of people that had made it to the final event, and picked out a few possibilities. Granted, that was if Angel had even made it to the top 16. His top choices right now are mostly people who made it to the second event but not to the first. He did have a couple possibilities for the final round though. Pretty soon, Midnight was introducing everyone and explaining the rules, and the first 2 contestants walked up. One was his student, Uraraka. She had a strong quirk, but he wasn't sure if she had the confidence to win. The other one, however, he was from General Studies. He was one of the possibilities, simply because of the build and the hair. His records were sketchy, and his quirk was simply listed as unknown. It probably wasn't him, but he was going to pay attention anyway. The buzzer went off, and instantly his opponent leaped into action. She reached out to try and touch Izuku, but knowing her quirk he dodged, grabbing her arm and throwing her over his shoulder. She hit the ground hard, but because Izuku was restraining himself she didn't get sent over the line. He nervously glanced up at the announcer's booth to see Aizawa staring right at him. Quickly turning his attention back to the battle, he saw Uraraka running at him again. He felt bad, but the girl just didn't have any proper combat training. He jumped over her, landing on the ground just as she spun around. Turning around, he planted a kick to her gut and this time she was sent flying out of the boundary. The winner is Midoriya, from General Studies. Midnight was announced, and the crowd gave a few scattered bits of applause. He hurriedly went to the waiting room, not liking all the eyes on him. He had almost made it, when suddenly he found himself being pinned against the wall of the tunnel. Oh shit! Staring back at him was Bakugo, looking furious. The boy looked at him for another second, but then his gaze softened and he let go of Izuku's jacket. Izuku, is it really you? So he does remember. He looked down at the ground, suddenly feeling very shy. Hi, Kaken. Bakugo's eyes widened at the name, and he backed up. Where have you been? What happened to Auntie Inko? Izuku paused, hesitantly looking up at his old friend. She's dead. And as for where I've been, I can't really tell you. Just don't tell anyone that you know me, alright? Bakugo opened his mouth to reply when the buzzer for the end of the fight went off. I'm up next, we'll talk about this later, Izuku. Bakugo turned back one last time, and then went out into the sunlight. Pretty shaken from such a close connection to his past, Izuku slowly made his way to the waiting rooms where Shinso and Shoto were preparing for their own matches. Seeing him, they both walked over and congratulated him. You did great, Shoto said, smiling at Izuku. I guess, but I didn't like the way Aizawa was watching me. This is so nerve-wracking. Suddenly, Shinso's face lit up. Wait, that day in the vents? Was that note angel related? Izuku smiled sheepishly, which told Shinso everything he needed to know. Then Shoto spoke up. So when Aizawa ripped that grate off the ceiling, was that you too? You were there? Izuku exclaimed. Yeah, I always get there early. Before they knew it, it was Shoto's turn. His fight went smoothly, and he easily overpowered his opponent. They all heard Endeavor shouting from the stands, and in unison turned to glare at him. Next was Shinso. His match was also over in an instant, as he quickly took control of his opponent's mind and sent him walking out of bounds. He looked around nervously at the silent crowd, until he spotted Izuku and Shoto, who started clapping. Smiling, Shinso made his way to the waiting room. Izuku turned to walk away, but when he moved he was face to face with Uraraka. Oh, hi, he whispered as she glared at him. Suddenly her face softened, and she landed with a thud on the chair. Why did you have to be so talented? She said, slightly kicking her feet. You're not mad, Izuku said, surprised. She sat up, shaking her head. Of course not, you were simply the better fighter. I was pretty shocked with how strong and fast you were though. Do you have an enhancement quirk? He nodded, and she continued. I'm surprised you didn't apply for the hero course. You could have passed the exam easily enough. I guess it wasn't for me at the time. At the time? She questioned. Does that mean you're trying to transfer into the hero course? He shyly smiled, a little nervous at her enthusiasm. Yeah, that's the goal. I think. Cool, well I hope you get into my class. She waved goodbye, going to join up with the frog girl and the girl with pink skin. He relaxed, until of course he saw All Might slinking around in his deflated form. Instantly his happiness died away, and his mouth twisted into a frown. What is it? Shoto whispered, trying to see where his friend was looking. Izuku leaned in and said, Do you see that ugly blonde guy in a suit sneaking around down there? Yeah. That's All Might. Shoto's head snapped toward Izuku, at All Might, then back at Izuku. No way, are you serious? Dead. God, I hate that guy. Well, if you hate him, he must have done something to deserve it. So I hate him too. Izuku laughed and smiled. Thanks, Shoto. Then, a bell went off. Alright everyone, the next 4 matches. First we have Todoroki and Ida. The next match will be Midoriya and Shinso. At that, Izuku turned nervously toward Shinso, who just smiled back. May the best man win, he said, and Izuku felt his nerves calm down. The last 2 matches were Tokoyami and Ishido, and Bakugo and Kirishima. Shoto walked down to the stage, where he stood face to face with Ida. They exchanged blows, with Shoto quickly gaining the upper hand. Coating the ground in a thick layer of ice, Ida had a hard time running without almost getting sent over the edge, and he was looking very frustrated. With one final burst of energy, he ran at Shoto, who made an ice ramp over his head. Ida was sent flying up it, and Shoto shot up with a burst of ice and kicked him hard out of bounds, sending him crashing into the grass. The crowd cheered, and Shoto landed neatly on the ground. He knelt to the ground, and melted the rest of the ice. Now, it was Shinso and Izuku's turn. Heart pounding, he made his way to the stage and faced his friend. Ready and fight. Instantly, Shinso started throwing taunts, but Izuku knew better than to fall for them. He lunged at his friend, but restricted his strength a lot. He wanted to give Shinso a chance to show off what he had learned. He dodged Shinso's punch, elbowing him in the ribs. Shinso kicked his side, and he gracefully rolled with the kick. "You're going easy on me, aren't you?" Shinso said, frowning at Izuku. He opened his mouth to reply, before slapping his hand over it. He smiled at his friend, shaking his head. He kicked off the ground, jumping high into the air. Flipping over Shinso, he crouched low to the ground and sprang at his legs. Not being able to move out of the way in time, his friend was sent crashing to the ground. He went to stand, and Izuku saw his opportunity. Turning on his foot, he sent a round kick directly into his side, and he flew out of bounds. Breathing heavily, he stood up as midnight announced him the winner. He went to check on Shinso, who was groaning on the ground. "You okay?" he asked, reaching out to help him up. "Never better." He winced as he stood up, rubbing his side. "Remind me to never fight you again." "You mean?" Izuku laughed, and helped his friend over to the little medical robot who had come to collect him. He felt eyes on him, and looked up at the announcer's booth. Aizawa was staring daggers at him, hair starting to float up around his head. Izuku gulped, knowing he was probably number 1 on his suspect list. However, he wasn't going to give the hero confirmation just yet, and he walked away. Aizawa looked at the small boy staring up at him, emerald green eyes meeting his. "It's him. It's him, I swear to God." Hisashi turned to his husband with one eyebrow raised and said, "What? Izuku? No, it can't be. I told you, I see him all the—" Hisashi trailed off, and then a surprised look crossed over his face. What is it?" Aizawa questioned, staring at his husband. "Do you remember when Angel said he had a cat?" "Yes. Well, a little while ago Izuku showed me a picture of his cat that he had just gotten." Aizawa looked incredulously at Hisashi. "And you're just mentioning this now? I thought it was unrelated show." Hisashi complained, leaning back in his chair. "And at what time do you usually see him?" Hisashi buried his face in his hands, whispering, "Usually around midnight." "Oh, so you mean right before Angel patrols?" "You didn't realize either," Hisashi said, glaring at Aizawa. His mind was spinning, trying to think of any other connections the two might have. "Did you ever notice him doing something out of the ordinary?" Hisashi racked his brain, then his face lit up. "I mean, there was this one time when he and Shinso fell out of the vents right before class started. Does that count?" "Oh great, it was right in front of us the entire time." He sighed, shaking his head. "It was so obvious. He was right in front of me the entire time, I just was blind to the signs." "Hey, don't be too hard on yourself, he's a smart kid." Aizawa nodded, turning his attention back to the stands. There was Angel, no, Izuku. That was his real name. Izuku sat there, chatting with Todoroki and Shinso. He looked happy. He watched as the kid's eyes narrowed, and his gaze instantly flicked up to meet his. Izuku's mouth twisted into a frown, but just as quickly as it appeared it vanished, and he went back to talking like nothing ever happened. Now that he was paying more attention, his happiness looked almost faked, from the way his expression sometimes froze to the way his hand went to touch a spot on his clothes that probably held a weapon. He had no idea how he was going to approach the kid, but he knew he couldn't rush things. He had to let the kid come to him, and know that he could trust him. Trust both of them. The other two fights went smoothly, with Tokoyami and Bakugo being the victors. When the order of the fights was announced, he noticed that Izuku tensed up when he saw who he was paired with. Bakugo. The kid had a strong temper, but he was manageable and sometimes even thoughtful. The next fight was Todoroki and Tokoyami, and it was pretty clear who the victor would be there. He sat down, waiting for the fight to begin. Still rattled by the way Aizawa kept staring at him, Izuku kept fidgeting, until he felt his gaze leave him. He grabbed Shoto, and led him to a secluded area. "All right, you're not going to like what I'm about to say, but you need to hear it anyway." Shoto stared at him, waiting for him to continue. "You need to use your fire." His friend opened his mouth to protest, but Izuku continued. "I get what you keep saying, that you don't want to use your dad's quirk. And I get it. But it's not his quirk. It's yours. And it's up to you to decide what you're going to do with it. To his surprise, he saw Shoto's eyes start to water. I don't think I can. Just try. Please. I'll think about it. Izuku took a deep breath and nodded. Thank you. They headed back to the stands, and Izuku waited impatiently for his next fight. If Bakugo had stayed the same, he would not be looking to lose. But he lacked technique, and that is where Izuku could beat him. Pretty soon, it was his turn, and he stepped on to the concrete. Bakugo cracked his knuckles, smirking. I don't know how you made it this far, Izuku, but I am taking you down. To Bakugo's surprise, Izuku smiled. He was glad his friend hadn't changed. It was something he always admired about him. He held his head up high and said, "Bring it on." Bakugo instantly lunged with an explosive punch, smoke and fire filling the air. Izuku slid down to the right, jumping up to land behind him. Bakugo jerked his head around, eyes widening in surprise. A smirk crossed his face, and he quickly reacted and launched another explosion. Dodging again, he managed to grab Bakugo's arm and pulled him hard to knock him off balance. In the split second he took to regain it, Izuku took the chance to kick him hard in the chest. He was knocked back a few feet before using his explosions to prevent himself from being knocked out of bounds. Izuku prepared for his next attack, waiting for the inevitable. Bakugo leaped into the air, raining small explosions over the entire stage. Expertly spinning and dodging, he let smoke fill the arena. A flash, and he had him. Using most of his strength, he leaped up directly below his old friend, catching him right in the stomach. Grabbing his uniform, Izuku pulled himself on top of Bakugo and kicked off of him. Neatly flipping a few times and landing on the ground, he watched as his opponent barely stopped his fall with his quirk. He's running out of firepower. Before Bakugo could think, he raced forward again, ducking low to the ground and spinning to land a kick in his chest. This time, he couldn't catch himself and landed hard on the grass out of bounds. Breathing heavily, Izuku stood up straighter as Midnight announced the winner. His stomach twisted looking at the cameras, knowing for certain he was watching. He walked back, greeting his friends as they congratulated him. Guess it's you and me next? Shoto said, looking a little nervous. Just remember what I said? Izuku smiled, winking. Shoto nodded before walking off, presumably to think. Izuku risked another glance at Aizawa, still not sure how he was going to handle it. Well, avoiding his problems had always worked before. He wandered off, walking aimlessly. There was a pretty long break before the final fight, and he wanted to clear his head. This of course failed miserably when he ran into Hisashi. Nice fighting out there. Why on earth did you not try out for the hero course? Izuku relaxed his posture, putting on a lopsided grin. Guess I didn't think I would get in. He laughed nervously, trying to find a way out. Well, you absolutely would have. Oh well, at least I got to have you in my class for a little bit. Oh no. Hisashi had this look in his eyes. Was that pity? He knows. He has to. Continuing to play dumb, he put his hand behind his hair. Well, I should go meet back up with everyone. I'll see you later. Yeah, good luck, kid. Flashing one more smile, Izuku quickly turned away and walked as fast as he could. What was he thinking? There was no way he could ever come back to school after this. Aizawa would hand him over to the cops, and then everyone would know. He slid down the wall, holding his head in his hands. What am I going to do? The sound of the crowd snapped him out of his thoughts, and he slowly got to his feet. He walked out to the stage, barely hearing Midnight's words over the ringing in his ears. One more fight. One more, and then I have to deal with everything. Shoto started with a long line of ice, and Izuku easily leaped out of the way. Trying to catch him in midair, he sent out another blast at Izuku. To the crowd and Shoto's surprise, Izuku twisted in midair and kicked the ice, shattering it. You're going easy on me, he called out, walking toward his friend. You're wrong, Shoto replied, coating the floor in ice. Izuku dodged and weaved between attacks until he was inches away from Shoto. Caught off guard, he stumbled back and Izuku darted forward until he was right beside him. Do it, he whispered, before jumping to avoid yet another attack. To Izuku's shock, Shoto actually grinned. Eyes widening in surprise, Izuku watched as his friend burst into flames, a wild look in his eyes. You know you're absolutely going to lose now, right? Shoto smiled. Yeah. But that doesn't mean I'm going down easy. The words barely left his mouth before a large column of flame was shot toward him. Ha barely avoided it by dropping to the ground, but his uniform still caught on fire. He desperately tried to put it out when more ice spiked up from the ground. It caught his arm, sending blood splattering onto the ground. He almost fell out of bounds, catching himself at the last minute. He ran towards Shoto, kicking off one of the many spikes. He had to change course when he almost ran face first into fire, however, sending him hard into the ground. He watched as Shoto combined his ice and fire, and all he could do was cover his face when a gigantic explosion shook the stadium. The next time he opened his eyes, he was lying face first on the grass, close to the walls. He leaned against the wall for support, quickly locking eyes with a very worried-looking Shoto. He gave him a little wave and saw him instantly relax. He was quickly whisked away by robots and healed by a wreck-ovary girl. Before he knew it, he was on the second-place podium. Shoto was above him, with Tokoyami and Bakugo sharing third. All Might was presenting the medals, and Izuku had to physically prevent himself from pushing him away when he got to him. "You did a great job for general studies," he said, smiling down at Izuku. Izuku forced a smile, blood pooling where his nails were digging into his palms. He doesn't even remember me. He could feel himself starting to zone out, to get away from the situation, but he forced himself to concentrate. He gave a couple waves at the sea of people, trying to act happy. After what seemed like an eternity, he and the others walked back to a small room and were allowed to leave. He was almost out of school grounds when he sensed him. Ducking behind a tree, he peered over to see Aizawa clearly looking for someone. Oh no. Nope. He climbed the tree, trying to stay as silent as possible. When the hero turned the other way, he made a leap for the gate, rolling it to absorb the shock of the fall. He sprinted to the nearest building, leaping as high as he could. His exhaustion was catching up to him, and he only made it about halfway. He jumped again from there, making it to the top. He watched as Aizawa observed the grounds, before suddenly turning his head to Izuku's hiding place. He had just enough time to hop over onto the fire escape on the opposite side before he heard footsteps on the roof. "I know you're there, Midoriya. If you're worried about me turning you in, don't be. I just want to talk." Izuku stayed quiet, trying to decide his next move. "I can't do it." He silently jumped down, and for a reason he couldn't explain, as soon as his feet hit the ground he was running. When he finally stopped, he was surprised to find tears slowly falling. "What? Why am I crying?" A sob racked his chest, and he leaned against the wall. "I knew this was going to happen. I shouldn't have gotten so comfortable." He gasped for air, desperately trying to wipe away the tears. He ruined everything, trying to achieve a silly dream. He couldn't become a hero. He barely counted as a vigilante. He walked home, pushing open the door. Ignoring Amaya, he sat down at his computer and quickly typed an email. "Izuku Midoriya will be taking a leave of absence due to personal reasons. Inko Midoriya." He sent it, quickly closing the laptop and taking off his ruined gym clothes. He shoved that and his other uniforms into a dusty closet he never really used, before pulling out his phone and hovering over 2 contacts. He knew he had to cut all ties. His father would really be after him now. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead he silenced them, messages already popping up. With the sun beginning to set, he put on his vigilante clothes. It was pretty quiet. Most likely everyone was inside because of the sports festival. His body ached and he could probably use a 15-hour nap, but he had more important things to do. Nothing had been sitting right since he was first in the spotlight, and he remembered Shigaraki's anger at USJ. There was no telling what that freak would try next. He stayed close to UA, considering that would be the most likely place for him to attack. Shigaraki was not a patient person. He or one of his associates would be here. Sure enough, an hour later he saw a couple people lurking, arguing with each other. He dropped silently to the ground behind them before swiftly hitting the bigger one in the back of the neck with the handle of his knife, causing him to crumple to the ground. "Who sent you?" he questioned, holding up his knife to the other's neck. Shigaraki. "Well, you can go back and tell him to stop being a fucking coward and find me himself." He pulled away, allowing the man to run off. He continued patrolling, thankful there was no sign of Eraserhead. He started walking back to his house when he ran into a different hero. Could this day get any worse? What are you doing here, Hawks? Aren't you supposed to be a daytime hero? Hawks grinned, walking toward him. Just wanted to say hi. Didn't have much to do today except for watching the sports festival. Those kids are really something. Yeah, Endeavor's kid was pretty powerful. Izuku continued walking, hoping eventually the hero would get bored and stop. Unfortunately, all he did was pick up the pace and continued to stroll alongside him. That general studies kid really held his own against him though. I was impressed. Izuku glanced at him, frowning. Really? All he really did was dodge a bit? Hawks laughed, shaking his head. You clearly don't have an eye for a potential angel. The way he was moving was calculated, like he had done those kinds of stunts before. With a weapon he probably could have beat him. Izuku's eyes widened as he realized he had been walking toward his house, and now they were right on top of it. Shit, that was careless. What is going on with me today? He continued walking, making sure to not let his body language give anything away. They continued with random chit-chat for a couple more minutes until Hawks got a call. Holding his hand over the speaker, he pointed to it and shrugged. Izuku nodded, and the hero flew off into the night. He liked hanging out with Hawks, but tonight was not a good time. He backtracked to his apartment, quickly switching out his large collection of knives for a couple smaller ones. After all, where he was going would not take kindly to so many weapons. He pet Amaya on the way out, quickly heading to the old karaoke bar. He pressed the button, heading down the stairs. The bookshelf slid open to reveal. He had been there a couple times since Dabi, and the fact he was a more well-known vigilante caused many heads to turn when he walked to the bar. He sat down, and the bartender slid him something. He opened his mouth to decline, but the man got there first. It's just coffee, kid. He blushed, staring down at the drink. Was it that obvious? The bartender just smirked, pouring more drinks. I need some information, Izuku whispered. Have you heard anything about Tamura Shigaraki? Well, I know he's been trying to gather people into his little group. He tried to recruit a lot of the people here, but most turned him down after the attack on USJ. Recently he's been looking for more short-term partners, specifically assassins and bounty hunters. The bartender paused, staring at Izuku. Rumor has it he's looking for you. Izuku suddenly was reminded of the attack that ended up with his identity revealed to Shinso, and the puzzle pieces fell into place. Unfortunately. Anyone here know where I could find him? Sorry, but your best bet is avoiding him. That kid's got more than a few screws loose, and a powerful backer. Izuku nodded, finishing the coffee. Thanks. He hopped off, a little disappointed from the conversation. He slowly walked home again, wishing he had more leads. However, just as he was about to open the door, he sensed something was off. Pulling out his weapons, he slowly nudged open the door with his foot. What he saw made his heart drop. The room was trashed, more so than usual, with things scattered everywhere and cushions torn up. There were even more holes in the walls. Maya. He frantically started searching, not wanting to speak in case the culprits were still nearby. He was almost ready to give up when he heard the tiniest little meow coming from the closet. Not daring to hope, he slowly opened it and looked inside. Shining his phone flashlight, he saw a crack in the wall. Lightly tapping on the ground in front of it, he had to hold back tears when Amaya stepped out covered in dust. He held her close, sitting there for a few minutes. It's not safe for you anymore. We'll see each other again, I promise. He gathered up her things, picking up toys that were clearly stepped on or kicked aside. He tossed it in her favorite blanket, gathering it up like a sack. He placed Amaya on his shoulder before heading off. He arrived quickly to Aizawa's house. He knew the route well. He dropped down carefully, making sure not to disturb his cat. Peering in through the window, he saw Aizawa in full hero gear arguing with Hisashi. Giving Amaya one last hug, he dropped her off in front of the door. She looked at him but stayed put. He knocked on the door twice, before leaping over to the next building over, which was higher up. He watched as Aizawa opened the door, before picking up Amaya. She gave him away by turning her head to his hiding place and meowing. Aizawa looked up, and Izuku didn't bother hiding. He stood up, wiping tears as he saw Amaya try to get out of Aizawa's arms. Turning around, he disappeared into the darkness, with only Amaya's cries breaking the silence. Izuku opened the door to his ruined apartment, dust and plaster coating the floor. He ignored it, walking toward his bedroom and sitting on the untorn part of the mattress. He curled up, putting his head on his knees. Can I even stay here anymore? They know where I live. Actually, if more show up, I can question them on where he is. He knew he should probably install some tripwires and traps, but he was just so tired. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, but he lifted his head when he heard a bird chirping outside. Oh, I need to feed Amaya. He dragged himself up, making it all the way to the kitchen before remembering. And he broke. He dropped to the ground sobbing. He had really lost everything. Even his cat, who was always there when he had a bad day or was just tired for dealing with people, was gone. He cried until a small noise jolted him out of it, and he wiped his eyes. Pulling out his knife, he stood up, relying on his hearing since his vision was extremely blurry. He heard another sound, this one coming from the left. His vision was clearing, and he slowly crept toward the noise. He lunged out but stopped in his tracks when he saw. On the ground, a little brown bird looked up at him before going back to rummaging in the debris. He relaxed, tucking the knife back in its holder. He shooed the bird out of the window it had came in through, and then went outside. Where he was going, he wasn't sure. He just had to get out of there. He wandered the streets looking at everyone going to their jobs, taking their kids to school, and whatever else normal people do in the morning. They were so distant, so far away from the life he had. He felt nauseous, which reminded him he hadn't eaten in a pretty long time. He walked into the nearest food place, a small cafe. He ordered a sandwich and a cookie before going to sit in the corner. He was spacing out when someone stepped in front of him, and he raised his head. "Aren't you that kid from the sports festival? You were awesome, man." Izuku gaped at him, and the others who came over after hearing his words. They all shook his hand, congratulating him and making small talk. Izuku replied in short words, totally baffled people actually recognized him. He had completely forgotten that the sports festival was bigger than the Olympics in Japan. It took him a half hour to get out of there, but when he did, he was relieved. All that attention, well, there was a reason he never wanted to be in the spotlight. He walked around for another hour deep in thought when something grabbed his arm and tugged him into an alley. He instinctively grabbed them back, flipping them over his shoulder and onto the ground. Some sort of snake-man hybrid hissed back at him, before lunging forward and biting his arm. Izuku clenched his teeth together, kicking him hard in the head. While it was dazed, he punched it across the face and caused its head to slam into the wall. Grabbing his bleeding arm, he felt a wave of nausea and dizziness wash over him. Poison. He stumbled away, trying to come up with anywhere he could go. He obviously couldn't go home, they would know where to find him. Darkness was creeping around the edges of his vision, when he saw a little garden. He rolled under a thick group of shrubs, the low-lying leaves concealing him from view but with enough space for him to fit. He curled up, allowing his eyes to close as his body worked through the poison. When Izuku woke up, he was thirsty. He wasn't sure how long he'd been out, all he knew was it was dark outside. He crawled out of the shrub, weakly shaking the leaves out of his hair. His limbs were heavy, so he leaned on a tree nearby. He took out his phone to check the time, and almost fell over when he saw the date. It's been almost 3 days? How strong was that poison? His first instinct was to go back and check if anyone had been to the apartment, but thirst took over and he quickly headed to the nearest convenience store. He didn't even wait for the cashier to finish processing his order. He quickly unscrewed the cap and guzzled down the water. Grabbing his change, he walked out while in the process of trying to open his onigiri. He ate it on the way, and pretty soon he got to his home. And of course, he quickly noticed an extra broken window. It looked like nothing was taken again. They were probably just hoping to catch him off guard. He had hidden his laptop deep in the wall, so he wasn't worried about them taking it. Izuku climbed onto the roof looking out over the city. Should he even still do his normal vigilante patrols? Could he allow himself to pretend everything is fine? No, nothing was fine. But maybe beating some people up would help him cheer up a bit. He grabbed his mask out of his pocket, well worn with time. Not bothering to change into his usual outfit, he jumped off the roof onto the next, rolling with the impact. He felt the wind blow his hair to the side, revealing a scar he usually kept hidden. He had gotten it in one of his first vigilante fights. A villain had a quirk that could turn air into wind bullets. He had been too relaxed and it caught him off guard. But that was a long time ago. A scream snapped him out of reminiscing, and he leaned over the building to see a fight between two people, a girl shouting angrily next to them. One of the men had a serious burn on his face, while the other was basically unharmed. He jumped down, standing in front of the man on the ground. "Chill out a bit, man," he said, quickly ducking when a fiery fist swung at his head. "Is one of these two your boyfriend?" He called out to the girl, jumping off the man's arm and landing neatly behind the other guy on the ground. "Yes, the one who got hurt. Hokuto's my ex, and he's fucking insane." She directed the last part at the guy, which only angered him more. Izuku ran in and kicked hard on his kneecap, hearing the satisfying crunch as Hokuto went down. He slammed his head into the ground, then waved for the girl and her boyfriend to go. He jumped onto a high windowsill, then leaped again to reach the top of the tall building. Dusting off his clothes, he turned to keep walking when a voice came from next to him. "Where have you been?" He whirled around, dread squeezing his chest as he recognized the voice. "You've been completely gone. You can't just disappear like that," Aizawa said, eyes filled with concern. Izuku swallowed nervously, refusing to look the hero in the eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Why not? What's going on, Angel? You can tell me." Tears started to well up in his eyes as everything he wanted to say fought its way to the surface, but he pushed it down. He sighed, then reached up and pulled off his mask. "Because you're in danger. I'm putting everyone in danger just by existing." Aizawa sharply took in a breath as the little vigilante took off his mask, finally confirming what he had known all along. "Angel, no," Midoriya looked up at him, obvious pain in his eyes. "I'm a pro hero. I'm not scared of whatever trouble you've gotten yourself into. You don't understand," Midoriya shouted as he started to pace. He ran his hands through his hair, then sharply turned to look at Aizawa again. "He's after me. He will kill anyone to get me. I shouldn't even still be in this city, let alone playing vigilante. He's losing it. Something bad happened after the sports festival." He moved a little closer to Midoriya, who quickly scrambled away. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Just don't follow me. Just forget about me." He saw the vigilante wipe a tear before he turned away and jumped off the building. Every instinct screamed at him to chase after him, but he knew it would be pointless. Everything he said had just confused him even more. Who was after him? Why did he just drop everything and vanish? And what was so scary that it would cause the fearless vigilante to leave the city? Izuku ran and ran and ran. He still couldn't believe he had revealed his identity, even if the hero had basically already known. He stopped abruptly, gasping for air. Turns out being poisoned for days was very draining. He slowly walked up the stairs back to his apartment, ready to grab the little belongings he had and finally leave town. But something was off as soon as he stepped into the room. He scanned the area, trying to figure out what was wrong. A whoosh of air sounded from behind him, and he raised his arm just in time to block the person with a sharp knife pointed directly toward his throat. They both jumped back, the girl flashing a smile. He lifted his foot to move, but found he couldn't. He twisted the upper half of his body to see a man staring at the ground. The girl got a little chime on her phone, and her eyes lit up. "Bye-bye," she chirped, quickly leaving. A third person swung at Izuku, and he folded himself forward. The man lost his balance, stumbling in front of him. Izuku grabbed him, holding up a knife to his neck and feeling it dig into his skin. "Let me go, or your friend stops breathing." The other man laughed, and that's when Izuku realized his mistake. "Oh, he's not my friend." He just barely had enough time to look up to see the large object plummeting from a liquefied part of the ceiling, then he blacked out. When Izuku woke up, he couldn't move. Head pounding, he tried to raise his arms to feel for the damage but found them bound by thick metal chains. His legs were the same, and someone had duct-taped his mouth closed. He scanned the room, and his eyes narrowed as he saw who was standing to the side, shrouded in darkness. Shigaraki stepped out slowly, grinning at Izuku. "Well, looks like you aren't so talented after all, Izuku," he said, Izuku's name full of hatred. Izuku opened his mouth to speak, but the tape prevented it. He tried to talk anyway, until Shigaraki stepped up and ripped the tape off. Izuku scowled and growled, "Let me go now, Shigaraki. I want nothing to do with you or him." "And somehow I don't care," Shigaraki shouted. "How can you be so stupid, so careless, so weak and still be his favorite?" It's always Izuku wouldn't have made that mistake. Izuku was always so good at fighting that. It was obvious Shigaraki wouldn't listen to reason. But the problem was, even if Izuku got out of the chains, he wasn't sure he could take Shigaraki in a fight. He was still weak from the poison, and hadn't exactly been taking care of himself. But he had to try. "Fine. Let me out, and you'll get to see who's better. Just you and me." He saw Shigaraki's eyes light up, and Izuku was amazed he was dumb enough to fall for such an obvious trick. He laid his hand on the chains, and Izuku gulped nervously as they crumbled to dust. He stood up, rubbing his wrists. And then he pounced. He elbowed Shigaraki's throat, then twisted out of the way to avoid his hands. The scar on his arm burned, memories of being touched by that quirk flashing through his mind. He ducked a haphazardly thrown punch, then leaped high into the air and grabbed on an exposed rafter. In one fluid motion he spun himself around and kicked off the ceiling, tackling Shigaraki to the ground. In return he received a sharp kick to the ribs. Ignoring the pain, he pinned down Shigaraki's wrists, making sure not to get too close to his fingers. He twisted so one leg was pinning him down, leaving a hand free. He clenched it into a fist and slammed it down onto his face, feeling the satisfying crunch of broken bones. He got a couple more good hits in before he wiggled free, and Izuku leapt back to avoid him. "Even though I've been poisoned, hunted, and nearly killed countless times, I'm still better than you." Izuku's emotions were getting the better of him, old rivalries resurfacing. Shigaraki lunged, and Izuku dropped to the floor. He wrapped his legs around his, and with a sharp and violent twist, snapped his leg. Shigaraki went down screeching. At some point beneath his knee the bone was sticking out of his skin. Izuku got up breathing heavily and settled into a fighting stance. Shigaraki slowly staggered up, balancing on his intact leg. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness hit him and Izuku held up a hand to his head. "How hard did I get hit?" The answer was basically given when his hand came back scarlet. Shigaraki saw an opening. He lunged forward, arm outstretched, and Izuku couldn't move fast enough. Shigaraki grabbed onto Izuku's wrist, and although he pulled away instantly, it was too late. The skin and muscles around his wrist were crumbling away, and he screamed. For a second, just a second, he was about to use his quirk. But this wasn't USJ, it was only his pain he needed to worry about. He grit his teeth, and while he was running toward Shigaraki, he slipped a small switchblade out of his shoe. He slid under him, jumped up, and stabbed it deep between his shoulder blades. Shigaraki let out a cry of pain, staggering away from Izuku. Izuku's wrist was starting to bleed now, blood dripping onto the floor quickly. He walked toward Shigaraki, fully prepared to end this once and for all. But then it happened. The two men who attacked him earlier jumped through a liquid part of the wall, grabbed his arms, and pinned him to the ground. "You cheater! You fucking cheater! You knew you couldn't beat me yourself, you coward!" Izuku shouted, panic setting in as Shigaraki walked closer. He gestured with his head to the center of the apartment, and the men dragged him there. They tied him back to the chair with rope this time, but as soon as they tightened it, the rope hit exposed bone and he almost blacked out. To his surprise, the three of them left without another word. Only an evil grin revealed something more sinister at work. And then he smelled smoke. They set it on fire. Izuku knew if he didn't get out of there now he would die. But whenever he tried to move his hands to escape, the rope just rubbed against exposed bone and muscle and lit an excruciating pain up his entire arm. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, or just if he blacked out and forgot, but soon the walls were covered in flames. He started choking, smoke filling his lungs. The heat was getting unbearable, and the already unsteady foundation of the building was making some sounds that did not sound good. He was exhausted, the puddle of blood growing around his feet every second. All that time running and this is how I go. Not really sure what I expected. His eyes started to droop closed, until a piece of burning wood fell from the upper floor and landed right next to him. Sparks exploded, and he jolted awake. He had to get out of there, he was too exposed to the apartment collapsing on top of him. He steadied his hands on the back of the chair, taking extra care not to rub the rope any more than necessary. Taking a deep breath, he pulled his ankles apart as fast as he could and heard the relieving snap of the rope. He gently got up and lifted his hands clear of the chair. Normally he would try to move them to the front of his body, but the pain was too much. He coughed again, flinching as more burning pieces of the ceiling rained down. He couldn't see any exit, smoke and fire filled his vision. He walked to the right trying to find it. He couldn't get too close to the wall, and he could feel his breathing getting weaker every second. Suddenly he saw it. The doorknob glinted in the firelight, and he started moving toward it. A large crack sounded from below, and the floor started to shake. Part of the floor crumbled away, and Izuku couldn't get away fast enough. He fell down to the floor below, hitting the ground with a cry of pain. This room was also engulfed in flames. He tried to stand up, head spinning, but before he could something heavy landed on his back. He was thrown to the ground, and a few more cracks and crashes were heard from above. He lay there, disoriented and dying. I don't want to die. Please, anyone, help me. I'm scared. His thoughts were jumbled, heart beating rapidly. Then the upper floor collapsed. Izuku curled into himself as debris rained around him, many pieces hitting him. A particularly heavy piece of wood hit him dead on, pinning him to the ground and probably snapping a few ribs. Izuku could barely feel the pain, smoke inhalation clouding all his senses. His eyes began to close, and as much as he was desperate to live, he couldn't fight anymore. He let them shut and slipped into painless darkness. Aizawa saw smoke before the flames. He had been scouring the area for Midoriya, but hadn't had any luck. He was running toward the smoke before he fully realized it, certain the vigilante was somehow involved. It was a building he passed often in his patrols, an abandoned apartment complex that had a few to many villain attacks. He covered his mouth with his scarf, going straight toward the center of the fire. He picked his way around burning pieces of the building, calling for Midoriya as he went. Smoke filled the room, making it almost impossible to see. He could hear sirens outside, but the fire was too strong to put out easily. Every second that passed, his hopes of finding the vigilante plummeted, and he prayed that he had gotten out already. His head started to spin, and he knew he had to get out before the building became his grave. He stepped forward, but suddenly the floor made a loud snapping noise. He reacted quickly, throwing up his scarf so it wrapped around part of the ceiling just as the floor collapsed. The motion had disrupted the smoke, just enough that he caught a glimpse of an arm emerging from a pile of debris. His heart jumped into his throat as he dropped down, carefully pushing pieces of ceiling off of him. He reached down to grab the vigilante's wrist to pull him out, but stopped short when he saw the puddle of blood spreading out from under it. He instead grabbed higher up on his arms, and with a hard tug he came free and they both fell on the ground. Aizawa quickly flipped him over, shaking him hard. Midoriya! Wake up! To his surprise and relief, his eyes cracked open and he kept out a weak cough. His eyes were unfocused, and they quickly closed again. Shit, Aizawa said, picking him up carefully. Thankfully they were right next to the door, and it took only a firm kick to make it collapse in on itself. He rushed down the stairs where ambulances and fire trucks were blaring their sirens. Time seemed to speed up, and before he knew it, Midoriya was taken from him and loaded up into an ambulance. The police asked him a few questions which he thought he answered, but he honestly couldn't be sure. And now he was sitting in the cold, uncomfortable hospital chair, waiting for any news on the kid's condition. Hisashi came running through the door and quickly spotted Aizawa. He ran over and gave him a hug. Usually he would protest, but he couldn't find the energy. Hisashi sat next to him, leaning in close. What happened? I'm not sure, Aizawa finally said. I saw fire so I went toward it. I'm guessing he was living there, but that place has been abandoned for years. And there was no way that fire was started accidentally. He was hurt, in more ways than debris and fire can cause. Aizawa put his head in his hands, letting out a sigh. If I had just found him sooner, none of this would have very happened. Hisashi shook his head, leaning back. There wasn't anything you could have done. He obviously knew something was wrong, and he made every effort so that you couldn't find him. He's smart, too smart for his own good. They sat there in silence for a little over an hour until a doctor came up and approached them. Are you the guardians of Midoriya Izuku? After a quick glance at Hisashi, Aizawa nodded. Yes. How is he? I'm happy to report he just came out of surgery and is stable. He had a strange injury on his wrist, a few broken and cracked ribs, a major concussion, and he inhaled a lot of the smoke from the fire, but he should wake up soon. The list of injuries wasn't exactly comforting, but he was relieved it wasn't worse. They both went inside the room, and Aizawa heard Hisashi take in a sharp breath of air when they both saw him. He was deathly pale, hooked up to multiple machines. We are planning on switching him from intubation to just oxygen soon. People in these situations tend to react badly if they wake up with a tube in their throat. Hisashi nodded for him, and he and the doctor both walked out to discuss it further. Hisashi tapped Aizawa on the shoulder as he left, a small but welcome bit of comfort. He sat down beside Midoriya, finding it hard to believe this was the same troublemaking, fearless vigilante he had fought alongside for so long. He had to find out who hurt him, but that would wait till after he was sure he was okay. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, but a small noise startled his eyes open. He watched carefully as Midoriya's hand twitched again, and then his eyes shot open. Those were his first thoughts as he became conscious. Before opening his eyes, he tried his best to take stock of his injuries. His chest and wrist hurt the most. Definitely broken bones. He had an insane headache, his lungs burned with every breath he took. He was definitely in a hospital, but the real question is which one? A safe one, or was he back in the facility he tried so hard to escape from? He opened his eyes, quickly noticing Aizawa staring at him from next to the bed. He could barely think. Whatever was dripping through the fore in his arms seemed to muddle his mind more than the pain. He started to sit up, but found himself quickly held down by Aizawa. How did he get over here so fast? "Me," he mumbled, raising his hands to try and push him off. "Just calm down, okay, you're safe. Moving will only make it worse." "Where is he? Where is who?" Izuku managed to get a hand past Aizawa and pulled off the oxygen line, tossing it to the floor. "That bastard Shigaraki. I'm going to kill him." Realization of what happened dawned on Aizawa, but he mentally put it aside for later. "I don't know. But you need to calm down before you hurt yourself." Izuku tried to protest, but his body failed him. He slowly sunk back into the bed, his vision dimming. He could just make out Aizawa talking with the doctor who had rushed in before he succumbed to the dark. The next time he woke up, he felt a very different emotion. Panic. He was in a hospital with police officers, his identity was completely exposed, and he currently had no weapons, no house, and no way to escape. He lurched up, frantically pulling out the IVs in his arm. Thankfully nobody was in the room, and he pushed off the bed. As soon as his legs tried to support his weight, he crumbled, still extremely weak from the fire and fight. He caught himself on the windowsill, lungs burning with the effort. He tried to open the window, but to his dismay it was sealed shut. Just then, footsteps sounded from behind him, and he quickly turned. Aizawa was there, hands up. "It's all right, Midoriya. Nobody can hurt you here." No, you don't understand. I need to get out of here." His voice broke, and he started to tremble. Aizawa rushed forward just as he fell to the ground, and wrapped his arms tightly around Izuku. He couldn't break. He had managed alone before. When his mom was killed, when he was living on the streets, every time he had come so close to death, all to losing the only place he had considered home. But why were tears falling now? Why did all the walls he had spent years building up seem to have disappeared? It wasn't fair. He didn't want to feel these emotions, the anger, sadness, and fear he had pushed away for so long. He had to not feel them, to keep himself alive. "It's all right," he heard Aizawa whisper above him. And he broke. Sobbing, he clutched Aizawa's shirt tightly. "I was so scared. He was going to kill me. I was supposed to die." He cried. You didn't. You didn't, you're still here. And I promise you, you will never have to feel that way again as long as I can help it. He wasn't sure how long the two of them sat on the floor, but when Izuku calmed down, Aizawa helped him back into the bed. I can't stay here. I've healed fine without hospitals before, so tell them to let me go. Izuku whispered, glancing nervously around at all the machines. I'll see what I can do. Stay put, all right? Izuku nodded defeatedly, curling his legs to his chest. Aizawa came back a few minutes later, carrying a glass of water. He handed it to Izuku, who drank it while Aizawa said, I talked to the doctor, and the best they can do is discharge you tomorrow afternoon, but only if you promise to not do any type of physical activity for at least a week. He paused, gauging the vigilante's reaction. Also no fighting until I deem it safe. At this, Izuku raised an eyebrow, slightly slamming down his cup. It's fine, I fight when I'm injured all the time. Aizawa rolled his eyes, sitting down next to Izuku. That's the problem. I don't care how fast your quirk helps you heal, the scans the doctors did showed a lot of previous injuries that never healed right. If you're going to be living with me, you need to be more careful. Izuku clicked his tongue, then moved to say something before stopping short. Wait, live with you? I have a perfectly fine... He frowned, eyes downcast. He had forgotten he didn't have a home anymore. Aizawa shook his head, leaning back into his chair. I don't know what you're thinking right now, but me and Hisashi already discussed it. You're going to live with us, and that's final. You can stay in the guest room, same as when you were a cat. Izuku blushed at the memory and went to protest again, before realizing it was pointless. It's not like he could stay with Shinso, and certainly not Shoto. He sighed, running a hand through his currently matted hair. Fine. Knowing he had won, Aizawa smiled. Great. I'll tell Hisashi. Is there anything you want us to look for where you were staying? Not all of it burned down. Izuku thought about it for a second before replying. I guess so. Maybe some of the weapons survived. All right, I'll let Hisashi know. Aizawa walked out, and Izuku leaned back. What was he thinking? He would only put them in danger. But the selfish part of him really wanted to do it. To have a stable roof over his head, a soft bed, actual food, and other people. He didn't have to be alone anymore. Plus Amaya was there and he missed her a lot. He had lost track of his phone at some point, so he couldn't contact anyone. Plus he was going to have to show up after being all dramatic about leaving. Izuku buried his face in his hands, starting to get overwhelmed with everything that went with his decision to stay. He could feel his breath start to quicken, and tried to get in under control. He raised his head slightly to look at whoever walked in, still trying to get his breathing to even out. Hey, you alright, kid? Aizawa said as he quickly walked to Izuku's side. He shoved his head back into his legs, nodding. He said, his voice muffled. Yeah, I'm not really buying that. He tilted his head to the side, looking through his bangs. I thought I did a good job selling it, he joked. Are you alright? I'm fine. After a few seconds of hesitation, Izuku continued. I guess I'm a little worried about dealing with everything now. Well, just take it as it comes. You don't need to rush anything, your friends will understand if you're not ready to talk to them yet. I guess you're right, Izuku sighed. He went to stretch, but a sharp pain burst in his chest. He doubled over, wincing. Aizawa shook his head, but helped him lie down. Just rest until tomorrow, okay? Or else we will have to keep you here longer. Izuku was planning on nodding, but he was already asleep. He stood near the hospital door, leaning heavily on crutches. He glanced nervously between Aizawa and Hisashi, the reality of his situation hitting him hard. Aizawa was going over some final thing with the doctors, and Hisashi snuck him a quick thumbs up. Soon Aizawa turned to him with a thick stack of paperwork and motioned for the door. All right, Izuku, let's go. Taking a deep breath, he slowly made his way out into the car parked nearby. By the time he sat down, he was already exhausted. He could barely move his left hand, making things very difficult. So, Izuku, Hisashi said as he gazed up at the rearview mirror, I grabbed a bunch of stuff at your old place. Not sure how much of it you still want, but it's at the house and you can just sort through it whenever you feel up to it. Thanks, Izuku whispered, voice still hoarse from the smoke and previous yelling. Soon they arrived at the familiar apartment, and though Izuku had stayed there multiple times he still felt nervous. Standing in front of the door, Aizawa unlocked it and his worries quickly vanished. "Amaya!" he shouted, letting his crutches fall and dropping to the floor. The fluffy kitten jumped into his arms, meowing happily. "I'm so sorry," he said in a hushed voice so only she could hear. "All right, get up before you hurt yourself," Aizawa said from next to him, nudging him with his shoe. "Finny," he sarcastically replied, but when he tried found he couldn't support his weight. He felt his cheeks go red as he stared at the ground, and softly muttered, "A little help please." He glared as Aizawa stifled a laugh, but he gently leaned next to him and helped him to his feet. He dropped Izuku off on the couch and he sank into the soft cushions. "Hisashi stopped by the mall and grabbed a couple things in your size, but we can go shopping after you heal for a more complete wardrobe. Oh, and we got you this, figured yours melted." Aizawa tossed Izuku a new phone, and he stared at him with his mouth open. "You didn't have to," Izuku said, now staring in wonder at the box. "We kinda did, how else could you contact us?" Aizawa shrugged, sitting down a little ways away from Izuku. Izuku opened it, aware of the TV turning on but not paying much attention to it. Amaya curled up on his lap, and he downloaded the old apps he had and logged into everything. He saw the large number of notifications and felt his stomach twist in guilt. He quickly opened Discord and sent the same message to both his friends. "I'm fine, I'll explain later." He leaned his head back, but the worry quickly faded. Aizawa and Hisashi were talking softly, the TV was on, Amaya was purring, and he finally felt safe for the first time in weeks. Maybe choosing to stay wasn't a bad decision after all.